Hi, this is Daniel Levine. Before we begin this week's episode of the Bio Report, I wanted to share some exciting news with you. Starting in January, I'll be hosting Rarecast, a new podcast with Global Genes and their publication Rare Daily, where we'll explore the intersection of business, policy, and science around rare disease. Stay tuned for more details in the next few weeks and keep an eye out for us on raredaily.org. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. The cost of drug development, a metric that underlies discussions ranging from investment in startups to drug pricing, is a matter of great interest and controversy within the pharmaceutical industry. The Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development recently completed a new estimate of the cost of developing a new prescription drug and raised it to $2.6 billion, up from $802 million in 2003. We spoke to Joe DiMasi, Director of Economic Analysis at the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development and Principal Investigator for the study, about the findings, why there's been dramatic growth in cost despite efforts to reinvent drug development, and whether there's reason to think the trend will reverse itself anytime soon. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
You are the keeper, the calculator, the developer of what is probably one of the most oft-quoted numbers in the pharmaceutical industry. You've just updated your numbers, and we're going to talk today about what they are and how you arrived at them, but perhaps more importantly, what they mean. Let's begin with the numbers themselves. How much do you calculate it costs to develop a drug today, and how has that number changed over time?
Well, the top line number is approximately $2.6 billion per approved compound. Now, that number includes the actual cash outlays expended on drug development from discovery to approval, and that amount is approximately $1.4 billion. The difference, $1.2 billion, is what we would consider a time cost to new drug development. That is, if you view drug development R&D as an investment, it's an investment that pays off, if it pays off at all, only many years after the expenditures are incurred. So there's in effect a cost to the delay between when expenditures are incurred and when potential returns are earned, and we essentially monetize that time cost and the amount we get based on an appropriate discount rate, which is the in this particular case the cost of capital for biopharmaceutical firms. That's how we get the $1.2 billion to add to a total of approximately $2.6 billion. Now, the $1.4 billion cash outlay is also divided up into costs incurred after initial clinical testing has begun, and costs incurred prior to when initial clinical testing has begun, which we refer to as pre-human costs. That would include discovery and preclinical development.
Your study also suggests there are considerable costs that are incurred after a drug is approved. What are those costs?
Well, those would be all R&D incurred after a drug is initially approved by the U.S. FDA. So it would include new indications for the already approved drugs, approved drug, new formulations, new strengths, new dosage regimens, whatever needs to be done, if anything needs to be done to meet the requirements of approval, that is post-marketing requirements, maybe perhaps imposed by the FDA or other regulatory authorities. Basically, all R&D that occurs subsequent to initial marketing approval. And we calculated that amount to be approximately 20, in terms of the actual cash outlays, approximately 25% of the total life cycle R&D costs per approved new compound. That is the pre-approval costs plus the post-approval costs.
So essentially taking you from about 2.6 to 2.9 billion?
On a capitalized basis, that is taking into account the time here and time costs, that would take us to approximately 2.9 billion.
So walk us a little through the calculation. Where does the data come from? How do you determine what drugs are included, what companies are included in the survey?
Well, we maintain a database of investigational compounds for our top 50 firms, and for the firms that agreed to participate in the study, there were 10 firms that participated in the study. We randomly selected a number of compounds that, according to the data we already had, first entered clinical testing anywhere in the world from 1995 to 2007. And we followed those drugs through 2013. Most of them, the vast majority of them failed during clinical development well before 2013. Some of them got approved in that period. There are a number of other parameters that are used to develop our cost estimates and that are critical, which include development times and clinical approval success rates, as well as phase attrition rates, phase failure rates within clinical phases, and we estimated those risks in particular based on a larger database we had of compounds that met the study inclusion criteria, nearly 1,500 compounds, and that allowed us to estimate the likelihood that a compound that enters clinical testing will proceed from one phase to the next and will eventually get approved. And the overall clinical approval success rate turned out to be much lower than it had been in the past, just under 12%, in particular 11.8%. That contrasts to what we had found for a previous study in an earlier period of an approval success rate of a little more than 1 in 5, in particular 21.5%.
So the cost of failure has actually increased here?
Pardon me?
I say the cost of failure has actually increased during this time?
Well, the proportion of compounds that failed increased, and that, other things equal, that will result in higher costs, higher cash outlays.
Well, there was a mantra for many years about failing fast. Has the industry been able to get smarter about drug development and kill drugs earlier in the development process rather than fund large, expensive trials that fail, or is this still a problem?
Well, interestingly, they apparently did get better at that, in that our data show that the drugs that failed, they did fail somewhat earlier in the process. And that has the effect of moderating any increases in cost. Unfortunately, that was overwhelmed by the overall decline in the overall in the overall approval success rate. While they were able to fail the failures earlier, they encountered more failures in the process.
So the numbers are not without controversy, although while some critics in the past have suggested they significantly overstate the true cost of drug development, others have made the case that the cost is actually considerably higher. Why do you think there is such controversy and inconsistency in how people calculate this number? And why, given the fact that these are by and large public companies, isn't there more transparency around this?
Well, there's transparency in their overall R&D expenditure levels, so you find those on financial statements. But the going down to a lower level, the actual project level, those costs are confidential. I'm not aware really of any valid, if you will, study that shows that the costs are substantially lower. What's usually done is that the critics are you sort of take apart the various components here and assumptions here, and sort of sometimes ask themselves, well, what would it be if we didn't do this or we didn't do that methodologically? For example, if we didn't include time costs, or if they included tax credits and the expensing of R&D expenditures on for tax purposes by companies. We were interested in, because we think it's valid to include opportunity costs, in particular the time costs of new drug development. But we also explicitly label our results as pre-tax, as we're interested in the actual resource costs expended in the private sector for the development of new compounds, and imposing some tax structure on the process will mask changes over time, because tax structures change over time. Some of the other, so the higher estimates are use the published company R&D expenditure data and look at the number of approvals of those companies. One problem with doing it that way is that there's a significant lag structure between when expenditures are incurred and when approvals occur. So that if you use essentially a contemporaneous set of expenditures and approvals, you'll tend to overestimate somewhat the cost of drug development if R&D expenditures in the industry have been increasing over time, which has been the case.
So from study to study, has your methodology been consistent?
Absolutely. It's really the same methodology across a number of studies over the decades. This is the fourth in a series.
Even if someone disputed these numbers, I think, given the consistent methodology, there's been a dramatic increase in the cost of drug development.
Absolutely. That's certainly what our data show. If you take the last study and put it in the same year's dollars, I should say our $2.6 and $2.9 billion figures were calculated in terms of year 2013 dollars. If we take the old study and put that in year 2013 dollars, we see that there was a 145% increase in cost per approved compound between the last study and the current study, and the effective difference in periods between the studies is approximately 11 years.
Why the dramatic growth in the numbers, particularly at a time when we're seeing more targeted therapies and drugs aimed at smaller populations that should be less expensive to develop than the types of blockbuster indications that characterize the focus of the industry historically? Is it just too early to see these trends affect the numbers?
I think it is too early to see these trends given the period that we analyzed. It's also the case that firms have been increasingly looking at more indications prior to initial approval. So while a particular targeted indication may not have large clinical trial sizes, may or may not have large per patient costs, the cumulative effect of looking at a number of targeted indications prior to approval, more indications than in the past, is a factor actually that could lead to increased costs. But as to how that's all played out for the focus in development in the last few years, that's really something that would have to await the next study.
The pharmaceutical industry has traditionally pointed to these numbers and the high cost of drug development to make the case for why drugs are expensive as they are, the need to recoup the high cost of drug development. But it seems over time these numbers, particularly for large pharmaceutical companies, have started to form a different case. We've seen a number of smaller biotechs produce drugs much more cost effectively and faster than large drug makers. This has to do with the nature of what they're developing, but even though drug development is high risk and expensive, do these numbers tell a story other than massive inefficiency and waste? Would you argue that there are other things going on?
Well, I think certainly some of the increase is due to the fact that firms, I think, have been targeting more difficult areas, more scientifically and medically difficult problems. There's been a substantial growth in biomarkers, but a lot of them are not validated. So, but the scientific developments have led firms to nonetheless pursue a lot of these biomarkers, which I said have not all been certainly not all been validated, and that can lead to more failures than we've had in the past, and then we've certainly seen, they said, success rates declining over time, and with more failures, you get higher costs.
Well, the other change we've seen in recent years, driven in part by changes in healthcare payment schemes, but also by drug makers themselves, is this move to pricing drugs based on value. In such a world, from a question of value, does it matter what drug makers spend on developing a drug when it comes to how much that drug should cost?
Well, if you look at individual drug products, the price, however it's determined, whether it's value-based or not, is not going to be determined based on the prior R&D expenditures for that particular drug, or even some measure of the average industry R&D costs. It's going to be determined by the competitive landscape, the practices and policies of payers and reimbursement authorities here and abroad, and I think to an increasing extent the value that these products bring to patients and to the healthcare system. That said, though, it does have to be the case that in the long run these R&D costs have to be recouped if innovation is to stay at its current level or increase. If R&D costs continue to increase over time, but pricing and reimbursement levels remain flat, you'd expect less development in the future, and so ultimately less innovation. So the R&D cost figures are a factor that help, along with pricing and reimbursement levels and other costs, help determine the incentive structure for innovation in the biopharmaceutical industry.
So while we've had a lot of deep thinking and changes to R&D approaches, does there anything out there give you hope you're going to see these numbers turn anytime soon?
Well, I don't think they'll change dramatically. I don't think and they certainly won't change in a revolutionary fashion in the short term. It'll be more of an evolutionary process. I think there's a lot of work on a lot of thinking about the clinical trial process and how that can be made more efficient, if we can make use more of adaptive designs and so forth. There's a lot of thinking about how to better predict regulatory success based on outcomes up to a certain point during clinical development. If we can do anything to reduce failure rates, that will certainly help reduce costs.
Joe DiMasi, Director of Economic Analysis at Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development and Principal Investigator of the Cost of Drug Development Study. Joe, thanks as always.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.